I'm extremely sorry, but I'm coming from the new campus, and the traffic, as usual, was very bad, and it was, as usual, unpredictable, but it was very bad. Anyway, again, I'm very sorry for coming late, but I'm very happy to have Sarah Sadeh talking again in one of our monthly seminar series. Sarah is, as we always call her, born and raised at CMRS. She is a very important person at CMRS. She studied at CMRS. She had her diploma in Migration and Refugee Studies, which she then developed into an MA with the University of East London. And again, after she finished her MA, she came back to CMRS in different capacities. She managed many of our research and outreach projects. She has a PhD in politics from the University of York, UK. Now she's also an adjunct professor at CMRS, at the American University CMRS, the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at AUC. And she is also a regional consultant and expert in the field of migration policy and protection. As I said, she obtained her BA in political science from AUC and her MA in refugee studies from the University of East London in the UK. She has worked as a researcher and trainer with CMRS, as I just mentioned. She has also consulted for several international organizations and academic institutions, to name a few: OSCWA, IOM, International Center for Migration Policy Development, UNHCR, Terre des Hommes, Save the Children, Swiss Development Cooperation, University of Oxford, and Duke University. So today she will present part of her research, her PhD research on civil society and refugees in Egypt. So we'll take like 30 minutes or 40 minutes for the presentation, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So,
thank you. Thank you so much, Maisa. Can you hear me well? Not really. Okay, as Maisa mentioned, what I'm presenting tonight is part of main findings of my PhD research that I have recently submitted to the University of York, which was mainly concerned with the question of civil society refugees and politics of serving refugees, as well as different challenges that civil society face in the way they save refugees, and in kind of the politics of between them, as well as in receiving funds and different issues. So I would just like first to highlight the aims of the study. Actually, the study resulted from a personal interest. 15 years ago, I was assisting one of the scholars who was interested in the question of civil society. Her name is Grabska, and she was looking at why the paradigm of serving refugees in Egypt, as her case study, was more of a needs-based rather than a rights-based approach. And she came up with a few conclusions, and I kind of wanted to investigate the topic further as different changes have happened in Egypt in the last few years. And I wanted to tell a different dimension of the asylum narrative in Egypt. There's often a lot of attention on policies in terms of asylum countries, not only Egypt, and refugees and coping mechanisms, but there's less on this mezzo level between the bigger policymakers and refugees themselves. I also wanted to contextualize the challenges and opportunities facing civil societies with the local context. So I compared them to a bigger landscape of NGOs in Egypt, trying to understand the challenges and prospects for each. I also was interested in investigating the impact of the players of the global refugee regime. I mean, it's not only, we're not talking about Egypt in isolation, but we're also talking about donors, and we're talking about other players globally that affect refugees and the civil society in Egypt. And at the end, what I was trying to understand was the impact of all of these challenges and dynamics on the prospects of the civil society and also refugees in Egypt. There's the rationale again behind this was that in late 2017, the UN Special Rapporteur issued a report expressing its concern over the increased deaths at sea particularly the Mediterranean, and the failure of the refugee regime to address it, they particularly urge states and international organizations to collaborate with civil society as a key actor that has better access to refugees and is often isolated. There's a lack of attention towards refugees in Egypt. I think the previous research, as I mentioned in my previous part, was always about either the policies or about protection issues or about refugees themselves, but less about the mezzo level, as I have already explained. And I wanted to understand whether we can treat policy in a different way, like a top, rather than having it as a top-down approach, trying to understand whether also civil society affect the political and the policy discourses in Egypt. So the methodology was mainly that I tried to understand the response of such organizations towards challenges, and as I said earlier, the impact of such operations on the local discourses and policies. My time frame was 2014 until late 2017 with the issuance of the new civil society law in Egypt. I had to make some selections, of course, as to what I mean by civil society. I had my own definition, but it's mainly anybody or any entity that had a legal identity. So at this time, which I know is a little bit of a challenge and a self-criticism, I say is that I excluded intentionally community-based organizations. They are part of the bigger analysis, and I have interviewed some of them, but then I realized it's far-fetched to expect community-based organizations without a legal identity to play a role, especially in advocacy or in promoting prospects of refugees. Excuse me. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this comparative element where I try to interview other rights-based NGOs to try to understand whether or not they also serve refugees, and if not, why. I have so many ethnographic reflections about the journey, because it's a journey that I'm very passionate about and that took so many years. But what I want to say is that I also faced a lot of challenges when I was doing this research, especially capturing dynamic topic and evolving topic that was changing all the time. So it was not historical enough for me to say, well, I'm looking at this period until I had to have a cross-cutting date. There's a lot of issues about me being on the threshold, being a researcher, being a consultant, and a student. So sometimes I was allowed things, and I've heard things in one capacity that I might not hear it in another capacity. So this was a little bit difficult, and I use a piece by Ibn where she talks about the ethical considerations about what you hear outside a certain context, or if you wear different hats and you have dual memberships, and what does this mean in terms of your findings. With that particular issues, what I did was they constituted the background of my analysis, but there are issues that I wasn't able to present as my findings because I've known them through different ways, which I like to name as ways of knowing and ways of telling. So there were certain ways that I knew things, and there were certain ways the NGOs were telling me the stories. I mean, I remember especially the refugee-focused NGOs, when I first talked to some of them, I used to be asked the question, whom are you consulting for at the moment? Because this really made a difference in the narrative they were going to tell me. And there were, of course, other challenges related to this. It's a difficult topic, as you would all assume, and there's also lots of sensitivities around the topic, and that's why it was faced with what few scholars call the ethnographic cloaking, where you're kind of hidden, as if you're wearing a cloak doing an ethnography. So you in a way or another, you sometimes cannot, and this was one of the questions I had in my PhD examination, that you're protecting the identity of your respondents too much. And this was the only way, as per my agreement with them, to be able to present my findings. So I won't bore you a lot with academic debates, but I think they're just important for the foundations of my thesis and my research project, and they were based on Gramsci's analysis of the complexity between state and civil society. I mean, for Gramsci, he defines the state as being a political society and a civil society, and that while the state uses political hegemony through its apparatuses such as army, government, civil society is a tool of social hegemony, that it kind of influenced the society through means of direct coercion or social consent. I use particularly as the main theoretical paradigm the James Scott Weapons of the Weak, the concept of everyday resistance. And for Scott, he defines resistance not as an upfront manner, not as a revolutionary manner, but that there are different forms of resistance that he calls the art of disguised resistance. For Scott, normally that form is more of a de facto resistance rather than a de jure one. And there are 4 elements of this resistance. They are unorganized, they are individual, they are opportunistic and self-indulgent, they are not aiming at revolts or changing structures, and they appear as if they are compliant to the structures under which they are operating. He particularly criticizes the fact that resistance is often looked upon as something that is very virtuous, utopian, and selfless. So for him, resistance is self-indulgent, and a particular group that are resisting are usually interested, they have self-interest when they resist. I use also Judith Butler's understanding of vulnerability versus resistance. For her, she thinks that first you're vulnerable, then you resist. And there are 2 types of vulnerability. There is constructed vulnerability by others. And so when it happens, you decide to resist, and then you may become vulnerable. So for her, she's very critical about the concept of vulnerability. And that's from where I start my analysis about civil society and refugees, that none of them are particularly vulnerable. So I'm going beyond the discourses of the shrinking spaces towards looking at the way in which civil society have reacted to such shrink. And lastly, and very importantly, I use Asif Bayat and Reem Saad's analysis or definition of positive marginality. For them, they have criticized the fact that when you have a marginalized group, they're often looked upon as something negative. But for them, it's very positive. Sometimes when you have a marginalized system, this system has much more opportunities. So I kind of liked this idea because I always look at, and I'm going to explain now how the refugee regime is kind of isolated from the scene, which is sometimes good and bad. So just my last slide on literature, with the kind of broader topics that this piece engages with are the labeling and framing by Roger Zetter, in which he criticizes the fact that refugees are often framed by civil society and by service providers. So this is a refugee, this is a victim of trafficking, this is what have you. And he thinks that this kind of labeling and framing has affected the way in which services are provided to refugees. I add upon the work of the late Barbara Harrell-Bond and Grabska. They talked about the asymmetrical power relations between refugees and service providers, where always service providers come at a higher rank than refugees. So it's when you do it in a needs-based approach, it's as if there's an unequal relation between the giver and the receiver, and it's not a right that you take the service. I use very importantly the definition of Kagan, Slaughter, and Crisp, that UNHCR being a surrogate state. And for them, this concept of a surrogate state is that refugees often think that because there's a lot expected from UNHCR, that it's becoming a state within the receiving state. And then Kagan went beyond that by criticizing and saying that there are certain elements that UNHCR cannot provide because it's not a state. Like, for instance, the legal issues, etc. There are other debates that I'm going to go through as I talk about the findings, but mainly it's about the global refugee regime. And here I present a very interesting diagram by Alexander Betts from Oxford, in which he talks about how the international regimes serving refugees are quite complicated. So the refugee regime falls in between, as you can see. And then you have the human rights regime, what he calls the travel regime, security regime, humanitarian regime, and labor migration regime. And within each, there are different organizations that occupy these regimes. And for him, that kind of landscape have affected how refugees are being treated, and also the fact that there's a lot of competitions happening between bigger organizations and bigger regimes. So it's no longer the refugee regime, but there are other intersecting regime, like, for example, the travel regime. You have the regional consultative processes on migration, you have IOM, the EU Mobility Partnership, the security regime, you have different organizations, and so on and so forth. Before I talk about the findings of my research, I'd like to display a little bit of history about the evolution of the local refugee regime in Egypt from the 1980s until present. It was only starting the 1980s and the early 1990s at the beginning of large influxes. I'm talking mainly African refugees started coming to Egypt, and thus UNHCR starting working with its implementing partners. And then in the early 20s, and the late 1990s, you had the rise of refugee work reflected in more UN agencies working with refugees, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and legal aid. And the peak of such movement was in the 2000s until the 2010, right before the January 25th, where you have the rise of local CSOs, mainly Egyptian registered non-governmental organizations working with refugees. That was the rise of so many, and I'd rather not say who exactly, but there are a handful of them who are now registered as Egyptian organizations and work with refugees. And then you have a new movement with the new influxes of 2011 onwards, where you have the INGOs coming into the scene, and you have new actors manifested in community-based organizations, Syrian-oriented NGOs, etc. Again, this diagram is not exclusive. It's my own understanding of the landscape of the refugee regime in Egypt. So you have, of course, the international donors, UN agencies, IOM, UNICEF, and of course all the other UN agencies. They just didn't have the space. So you have WFP, UN Women, and so on and so forth. And then you have these organizations mainly giving funds to INGOs and international organizations such as Plan, Caritas, Save, Care, CMRS, and Refugee Egypt. And there's also another layer of international organizations who are under different umbrellas like PISTIC, STARS, etc. And then comes the local NGOs, FARD, Egyptian Foundation for Refugee Rights, and Tadamun. And then you have the smaller CBOs. So it's a little bit of, sometimes the funds go direct to one of these, but it's usually this is the kind of the hierarchy in which the funds operate. The legal context, I'll also go very quickly because I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So we're talking about three main laws. Law 70 of 2017 that has replaced Law 84 of 2002. That's the law governing civil society operations in Egypt. You have the main policies in 2014. All organizations were required to apply for registration under the Ministry of Social Solidarity, and some of them have actually applied for registration. And then you have one law on combating trafficking and one law on combating illegal migration and smuggling of migrants. So going to the findings of my research, the structure is as follows. I looked at relations between civil society organizations and global regimes manifested in donors and international agencies, and also with the local authority apparatuses. And I also looked at civil society host community relations, Egyptians, and the civil society relations, so between each group and across the two groups. Those working with refugees and those that are more of rights-based, socioeconomic rights NGOs. So the first navigations in the local scene was in responses to the legal and policy constraints, and the second one was in handling a larger discourse of anti-otherness, so larger discourse of xenophobia, lack of tolerance towards working with refugees. But the first one, when it comes to policy and legal structures, it was reflected in such organizations applying for registration to comply, some of them avoiding high-profile legal cases, some of them looking through funding umbrellas and different structures in order for them to have a legal entity. But also, in many cases, there was less kind of stubbornness in reaction to any kind of challenges. So as I quote one of my respondents, our community school was closed down. We were informed that we have rented this space, which was earlier rented by an elderly shelter, and thus no income-generating activities should be held at the same place without approvals. We clarified that our community school is for free for refugee children dropouts, but the school was eventually closed. In order not to lose all our chances, we decided to close down the activity, even though it was operating legally. As another organization says, we deliberately stay away from advocacy or for all our operations. We are mandated to provide relief services to refugees. Despite the fact that we provide legal aid, it's in the context of UNHCR's legal services, not representation in local courts. The final two quotes, one of them by another organization that says, after registration, we initially started operating with few community centers outside the office's premises and later expanded to more during the Syrian crisis and more funds. However, after losing approvals for funds and not being able to secure more funds, we closed our community centers. And last but not least was another organization that explained that one of a representative of one big international organization have asked them to register in order to be a formal partner, which they have actually done, and eventually they got registration. As much as they are facing difficulties, it really struck me that they were able to maintain very positive relations with all apparatuses regarding dealing with civil society organizations. What they have had a hard time with was explaining to everyone why they're serving refugees and not Egyptians. And it was always as if one of them said, I always felt that I wanted to apologize to different people that I was working with refugees. She said, I received official approval recently for a project providing education and health services to refugees. I visited the Ministry of Social Solidarity to receive the notification of approval. Although approved by senior representatives of the ministry, I was prevented from receiving the document by one junior staff who was supposed to stamp the letter. Her justification that she was not convinced of the aim of the project. She asked me directly, why do you work with refugees? Do you think there are no Egyptians who are in need? I responded by telling her that there are thousands of organizations working with Egyptians. Why won't you allow a handful to work with refugees? I feel I always have to apologize to entities and to Egyptians for working with refugees. I mean, despite also the gloomy picture, there was one particular incident that the respondent asked me to write it in my thesis, and I promised I will, and I did, and also to talk about it. She talks about one particular Egyptian woman in the community who is kind of the shield for everyone if any refugee had a problem. So she says, I need to tell you about the story of Yara in a particular area. She is a very influential woman where we have the biggest community center. Although she's Egyptian, we have trained her, and now she serves as our outreach person through locating Egyptian children to the services we provide for refugee children. Whenever any refugee faces any incident of harassment, Yara tracks the perpetrator and makes sure her network in the area protects refugees against any attack. She's like a shield for refugees in the area. So it actually does show that if you kind of include the locals in your services, it's not always a bad idea. My second element of negotiations was with UNHCR, as I like to call it, a surrogate state in itself, and with donor relations. So there were so many challenges related to this particular theme. The first one was the funding cycle problems, the fact that they always have to struggle to fit in a donor agenda. In the last few years, there has been lots of new projects called opening avenues for refugees in Egypt. I mean, for them, they're not particularly sure how they open avenues for refugees in Egypt, but they have to tailor the proposal in order to be accepted. They kind of complained that there was an absence of an open call for proposals where they can approach the donor with ideas, you know, in a certain sector, whether it be health, education, or employment, where they can, according to the needs of the community, they can kind of tailor the project. In recent years, also in many projects to be approved, there needs to be a quota for serving Egyptians, which doesn't work for organizations that normally don't serve Egyptians. So again, it kind of looks very artificial. And there's also the dichotomy of small, big organizations, which I will delve into in a bit. I think the issue with the donor agenda is big, and hence the title of my talk today. There's always an assumption that organizations also only work within the regulations and the laws and the politics of the asylum country only, but that's not the case, because donor agenda is very obvious in the type of call for proposals that you often find, and I will read some of my quotes. We receive funds from a certain agency or embassy to target specific groups in a specific time frame. Some interventions are completely irrelevant. For example, they may ask us to conduct trainings on sexual violence with women across different communities. When we host these sessions, we may find a woman or a child in dire economic conditions. In that incident, how should priorities be set? There's a clear lack of vision in setting funding agendas. A key problem is that you have to respond to a defined call for proposal, usually covering an irrelevant intervention, rather than you approaching the donors with the needs of the community. Another relevant one, by another organization. The respondent says, you end up working on either sexual and gender-based violence, victims of trafficking, or a specific vulnerability when there is a minimal need for it. We try to include other vulnerable cases under the same fund. We may not necessarily fit this criterion in our caseload to ensure we extend the services to the groups needing it the most. So, despite this fact, I mean, talking to one donor agency, he was particularly very critical about receiving duplicate proposals and not creative proposals. So again, it seems very bit contradictory between what the organizations express and what the donors see as a problem. But again, it shows that the fact that there is not, most of the projects are done, as I said, on the basis of agendas, right, rather than an actual need. This will actually take me to the third theme, which is the relations between organizations. But before I do this, I want to highlight the problem of the hierarchies of funds, partnerships, and staffing. So it's always, as I explained in my diagram, it's always a hierarchy of funds from INGOs to local NGOs to CBOs. So the bigger the organization is, the more likely it will get the funds, because UNHCR and other agencies think that there's a transparency problem and an accountability problem, which I think might be the case, but also not much has been done to overcome this problem. Like, there were not trainings in terms of accountability and budgeting given to these smaller organizations to avoid these issues. Again, there were also kind of competition over staffing as well, which, I mean, I'll delve in a moment. But before I do, I will talk about the experiences of incubating bigger organizations, incubating smaller organizations. As one respondent said, I tried working under a certain organization and before then under another one. I had a better experience with the former in terms of budget transparency and cooperation. The latter treated our cooperation as a subordinate and was not consultative at all. I learned by coincidence that we had a budget line for transportation, for instance, at a time when we were paying out of personal pockets. In the two experiences, the credit went to the incubator, and we felt this was unfair to our organizations. So while we are still open to the idea, we are currently counting on our own operations as a locally registered CSO, even if meant more delays in getting approvals for funds. Another smaller organization said something that was a little bit too sad. She said, UN agencies and INGOs simply approached me to solely use my contacts in the community in order for them to reach the target groups for their programs. They obtained my lists of refugees. Many of them were very hard to locate, residing on the outskirts of a specific city and unregistered with UNHCR at the time. I was paid a small amount as a consultant, and then later on, none of these organizations wanted to formally partner with my organization. Now they are using these lists and expanding the operations. Finally, so the competition, as obvious, is on programs and on funds, but it's also on staff. In one particular incident, one organization mentioned that her staff member went to another organization because they were recruited by the bigger one, and she was very angry about this. And also this leads me to another discussion about handling refugee representatives as staff in bigger organizations. But I'm sorry, before I do this, I think also one of the biggest challenges that organizations, smaller one, talked about was that there's an assumption that smaller organizations or local organizations cannot perform the interventions adequately. The fact that there's an assumption that they lack the necessary capacity to deal with refugees, as if dealing with refugees need certain skills that is not available in other organizations. When I definitely also, I think this, I talked already about CBOs and raising the capacity of CBOs, which is often in every project, and how CBOs themselves find this a little bit insulting. But other than this, I would like to talk about refugees being employed by INGOs and NGOs, and they. And this is a personal observation. I have realized that whenever I attend a meeting, I mean, you always find, one or two or three refugees accompanying the person who's in charge of the organization, and they're given only the floor when it comes to talking about community trends or certain issues that only a person from the community would know. But there's less about raising their capacity. I mean, they're rarely people of decision. So you always, it would really look like a good gesture, having refugees interacting in interagency meeting as members of staff, but they are normally given only the floor, as I said, to talk when it comes about community trends. They are normally hired as community outreach coordinators, and some of them are underpaid in comparison to other staff members with less guarantees. And the problem is many of them are also the well-trained and the most connected with the community, so these are the people who are more likely to be resettled. So they get resettled, so you end up having a void also for such people. What was particularly interesting, I think I've covered most of these things, was the absence of cooperation between refugee-focused civil society organizations and the rights-based civil society organizations. The rights space seems to be very active when it comes to detention, being caught at the borders by trying to irregularly cross the border, finishing all the procedures of detention, because they were much more familiar with the legal context in Egypt. But it was a little bit strange for me that they treated some of the ones I talked to, treated serving refugees as a seasonal matter. So it's not the season. I mean, one person told me, I know he was joking, but he said, it's not the season for serving refugees. I mean, we serve refugees in summer and in fall. So it looked for me a little bit like it's not something systematic, but I would understand why, because they said, we are often not very much welcomed by the refugee regime or by the refugee landscape. There are so many organizations serving refugees. We don't want to be crossing on their mandate. But again, that raises a lot of questions about the politics within the two groups and how serving refugees is very territorial for some organizations. I mean, in conclusion, what I would really like to highlight is that in one way or another, such organizations have won the front of operations very well. I mean, they have been continuing to operate amidst all, as I said, legal, financial, and difficult challenges, but with limited efforts to enhance prospects of refugees. Some of them have been very deliberate about, we don't work with Egyptians, this is not in our mandate. We tell our target groups not to interact with Egyptians, which for me might seem understandable if we're talking about security challenges, but if this is the stance of the organization, then what do you really expect in terms of opening prospects for refugees? The result is enhancing more needs-based approach and more dependency and more vulnerability and more temporariness. So the fact that as much as donors would somehow want to open perspectives, which is not necessarily what we would want to do, but for the best interest of refugees is not really so much looked at, but rather enhancing the sustainability of such organizations. So we still capacitate CBOs, we still have leverage over smaller organizations, and this is how things move on in a very linear matter. So not much has been progressed in terms of refugees. This has also led to a duplication of services within the UNHCR regime. So ironically, you find so many organizations working within the UNHCR regime, but what about the closed files, vulnerable groups, unregistered migrants, etc.? So you find that those who need it the most are not part of the organizations. I know some organizations, of course, serve closed files, but the majority are within the UNHCR scope. There is lack of role on the advocacy front with the state, despite the fact that so many of them have very close connections with state operatives and very positive relations. And there's, of course, an obvious sense of fatigue. I mean, I don't want to sound too critical. I mean, many of them, they feel that what they're doing does not do much, and they're kind of tired. As I read from one of my respondents says, bigger organizations keep using me to send messages to the community. How can we deliver messages to the community that we personally do not believe in? I'm struggling to get funding and continue, but if I had to, I will certainly close down. So again, what my research has concluded that while there has been a rise in different organizations and expansion of refugee service providers, the impact has become minimal. So the same services that were provided are now being provided, maybe with more services, but with the same approach. The approach of, like I said earlier, temporariness, needs, relief, but less in terms of creating prospects and avenues for refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was very informative. So we'll open the floor for discussion. I think I'll think about more questions during the course of the discussion, but to start with, I have very few questions. Now, when you are applying the theory of marginality and James Scott resistance, you are applying it on the refugees or on the civil society.
Okay.
So that's one question. The other question is regarding the right-based organization. When you say right-based organization, you are talking about organizations that are doing more of advocacy. Is that right?
Mm.
Okay. So, but then there is the right-based approach, right?
Oh, okay.
Which you are criticizing, that is lacking, right?
Yes.
So I was just hoping that maybe you should tell us more about right-based approach.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll come up with more questions, but for now these are the questions. And I would like to open the floor for discussion. So do we have questions? Okay. So maybe we take two more, and then take another round.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting. I'm particularly curious about this relationship between the refugee organizations and the human rights organizations. And I wonder if the uprising in 2011, but again, the restrictions that happened starting 2014, what these major events did to this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. So to build upon that question, could you talk a little bit about how the closure of Amira has affected the different organizations' approaches?
Okay, maybe you answer these two questions. Talking about the closure of Amira, because you mentioned that you are excluding CBOs.
Yes.
Okay. That or entities that don't have legal. So did you exclude also organization like how Amira used to operate? You know what I mean? Like.
No, I understand. Okay.
Like non-Egyptian organization that are providing services or
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you answer these questions and then we'll.
All right. And thank you, Maisa, for the very interesting question. I should have differentiated in my theoretical foundations. So for the James Scott, I was particularly interested in civil society because I was a little bit. I mean, I don't want to undermine the fact that there are, of course, legal challenges that civil society organizations are going through, but I want to go beyond the shrinking spaces type of narrative about civil society. So I said, okay, then if they are responding to that kind of challenges, they are in one way or another trying to resist the political structures. And I remember in one interview, and I was explaining my James Scott very proudly, and one of my interviewees said, Allahu Akbar, this is exactly what we're doing. She was very funny. She said, waking up every day, working in a difficult condition is actually kind of resisting the problems. So I was mainly talking about civil society being the type of people playing a role. For the marginality, and maybe this was more obvious in my research, it was about both of them, about the fact that we cannot talk about civil society as if they are vulnerable and as if they are marginalized, and the fact that they, I didn't want to explain this because it was too academic, that Butler came up with a concept called the disoval, and for her is a way in which one actor would be vulnerable but will try to construct vulnerability on another one. So, and I use it when I talk about the relations between NGOs or civil society and I will jump to one of your questions before I go to other questions about the only reason I use civil society and also in my research was deliberately moving away from the NGO. because I contested a little bit in my main piece the fact that there are some organizations in Egypt that are performing as civil society but are not registered as such. They have a legal status, so they do have one, but they are either under umbrellas of different organizations, umbrellas of INGOs, umbrellas of UNHCR, so I have only included these. So I've included some of them, but I again, for reasons of anonymity, I didn't wish to disclose, because as I said, that's what the promise was, but I've also included some faith-based organizations and others who perform the same services that civil society organizations are performing. When I talk about the rights-focused organizations, I mean either the legal aid organizations working with refugees or the bigger landscape of the legal aid organizations working with Egyptian detainees. They're working with marginalized groups. So I'm talking about the bigger landscape of human rights organizations as well. The question raised by Hiba is very interesting, because on the onset in 2011, there was, most of the organizations were working with everyone. So they were working with refugees, they were working with Syrians, with the influxes of Syrians, and there was a momentum where everybody was interested to be engaged. After 2014, it became a little bit different, where each category of organization had enough legal problems. And so I'm not necessarily criticizing the human rights-based NGOs that they're not working with refugees. It just struck me that they worked for a certain time and they formed different fronts, especially with detentions, but then they thought there were other people doing it. And the fact that I have to be very honest, that these other people do not know exactly the way the legal aid organizations do it, because they're more specialized in socio-economic. So definitely the political settings have affected the relations. For the closure of Amira, I tackled this in my historical chapter where I talk about the different landscape, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this here. And it definitely had an impact, because the closure of Amira led to the fragmentation of the people who have been working there. So either they moved into the Egyptian legal aid NGO landscape, or the type of the international/local service. And there was a void at that time, and I still remember this time, until there was also a void, and there was an anxiety among the community that, because of course Amira was working particularly on legal aid and had so many access to files. But then now most of them are, from my observations as staff and as operations, they are merged under one or other organization. So either the international/legal or the Egyptian, based on their background. More questions?
So maybe we take one more round of questions, yeah?
Yes.
Sorry, so just to clarify, what I mean is, that when I look at this list of conclusions, I see the ghost of Amira. So for example, a lack of role on the advocacy front with the state, this fear of engaging on a human rights level as opposed to a needs level, the exclusion of Egyptians and not wanting to merge with Egyptian organizations, it seems like that's a legacy of the closure of Amira. Would you agree?
Okay, okay. We'll take more questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. I'm just interested in more clarifications with regards to the further isolation by excluding Egyptians. Do you mean for excluding them because there is anti-sentiments against refugees, or because of the legalities, or because of what kind of restrictions, or because of securitization, or what exactly? Okay. Thank you.
There is another question here. Here.
So, thanks. I just want to, first of all, thank you, yes, and I'm working in one of these organizations. The logos appeared there. And yeah, the thing is, the lack of information, I don't know if the research was part from it. Like, it's not only work as well, I have a lot of friends from the refugee community. And I think the main problem, the main issue that they don't know that at the end, they are having the right to many things. For instance, the right to work. It's something very vague for refugees. Many rights are not clear who is supposed to offer this right. So the main suffering we suffer is that there is no clear information for the refugees in each step in their life, when they enter and even when they go out. And I lived with refugees in many steps of their lives, phases of their life, and in each phase, the main headline that it's vague. What is the steps we need to do in each step? So the point is not, I think it's not the duplication of the services, and I think maybe there is duplication. There is some services which are missing at all. It's not there, and there are services which is available, but they cannot reach to it. And even some of these duplicated services, they don't know how to reach to it. It's done by organization, it's done by UNHCR, but like they don't know how to reach to it because there is very few information. And maybe for the research center or for the university, it will be amazing if there is a database or something. Refugee can enter to it to know as much information as possible for them. Maybe it's not supposed to be your work, but maybe it's supposed to be really the work of UN or even the Egyptian government. As I see, for instance, I have some experience. I worked a little bit in Germany with refugees, and there is even websites and videos in Arabic for refugees and each thing they need to do. But this is not.
Maybe.
But
correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that there is a website by IOM, Bosla, which has information on all the organizations that work with refugees. But the problem of not knowing the rights and not knowing, not knowing who has which right is a gap. And I'm happy to say that some of the researchers are here. We're working on this gap in our center, and we're currently working on a long, 3-year-long research project on understanding the right of refugees in Egypt, the different rights, and who has access to which right, because it differs according to nationality. So I agree.
It will be amazing to, yes, talk after the session, maybe to exchange experience and know how to reach, to keep the refugees reaching I'm working as a media officer in Tadamun, yani. It's not something to hide. So yes, I would like to, to get the information and to give it to the people which I'm working with each day and I feel they are lost. Yes, this will be good.
So
Thank you.
You remember the question?
I don't.
So do you think we should have one more question, or you answered? Okay. Okay, then here and then.
Okay.
So we have three questions. Okay. No, that's fine. Okay. So we have 3 questions, so 3 more questions.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. I have a question regarding the challenges that you talked about on the obstacles that CSOs and INGOs even face here in Egypt. And I'm sure you know that there has been a trend in UNHCR for a few years to divert service provision towards governmental institutions. And I think it's governmental institutions, and to sort of involve the state more in refugee service provision. So I want to know, I think it's a way to maneuver these obstacles and also to maneuver the fact that UNHCR becomes a surrogate state or a parallel refugee regime that is completely separate than the Egyptian regime. So I just want to know what you think about that.
So we have a question here and then here. You don't have a question? Oh, okay. So then one more question.
I wanted to ask whether cooperation within the civil society organizations takes place or not, because you were saying there was duplication or lack of information, and whether it could be a good idea to take it to the more international level, I would say, and have cooperation between civil society organizations in the Mediterranean region,
Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. I'm not sure whether it's taking place or not, and if yes, to what extent it's efficient, yeah, and whether this would be possible or not.
Okay. All right. I'll try to remember. The question about Amira is very interesting. I don't think I have an answer for it, but I would love to talk to you after the lecture, if that's okay. There was a question about involving Egyptians or not. So, I mean, ironically, I mean, there are lots of solid refugee-focused organizations that were very, a little bit not happy that INGOs are jumping into the scene. And they said that they have never worked with refugees, they don't know how to work with refugees. But ironically, the INGOs, I mean, despite the fact that they're bigger organizations, they are the much more likely entities that work with both target groups. So that now when donors approach anyone, they will approach these. Because in Egypt now, as I said, I mean, with the relevant ministries responsible for funding, they say they prefer a quota for Egyptians, which is understandable. I mean, there's also lots of literature within the refugee that serving the local community with refugees is the optimal way when you're serving an area. I mean, so you prevent these resentments and xenophobias and feeling that refugees have more rights, etc. So but again, these refugee-focused organizations only work with Egyptians, and they think that it's very dangerous for refugees to interact with Egyptians, which I understand based on precedent, again, of xenophobia, but they kind of deliver these services, these messages directly or indirectly, like you should not be having friends or Egyptian, and I've heard this myself. And again, this kind of defeats the purpose. If we're talking about the fact that the refugees, it ends up with the refugees in a mindset, as if I was talking to one colleague who had to leave early, unfortunately. She said, there's a mindset that we don't want to work, we don't want to get training because we're leaving. And they don't leave. I mean, now they cannot cross the borders, and also the resettlement is shrinking. Return is not an option for so many of them. So what's the result? They're stuck in Egypt, but with the mentality that they are here as guests, are temporarily residents, etc. So sometimes, indirectly, these practitioners have kind of fed in the discourse about the fact that you're isolated, we have different regimes, you should not interact with Egyptians. And on the other hand, the trend, as you have mentioned very rightfully, among UNHCR, IOM, and big organizations, that they work with the National Council for Childhood and Motherhood, they work with different national councils to try to merge services. So as one UNHCR representative once said, we don't want to create parallel system, we're trying to enhance education and health to be provided to refugees. Of course, there are so many challenges in terms of procedures and reaching this optimal goal, but it's much better than having two, kind of exclusively parallel systems. The lack of info is a very interesting point, and as Maisa noticed, we're having a research project kind of having a database of all rights and relevant information. But what I meant by the duplication of service was serving the same people within the interagency of UNHCR. So of course there is cooperation as part of the interagencies that are working very well, and small working groups. But there are so many people outside these systems. So you're unregistered closed files, and Astadaman, you know that quite well. So these people are not part of any funding, and they're not part of any pool. So what happens is that you're serving the same people, kind of. You might not be giving the same service to the same people, but these are target groups. And in terms of information, the people who are most served are, again, your target groups. So the people who know nothing are normally people outside the system. So again, it is a big problem. That's why it's much better for funding agencies to target NGOs directly. That way they can fund either the registered or unregistered. But again, funding agencies prefer bigger organizations. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. I think I covered them all. You had a question about the regional or the international. I know that some legal aid organizations, they present in the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva. They attend trainings and they attend international forums, but an exact coordination I'm not familiar with. Maybe there is, but I don't think there isn't. I think there is also when we talk about the regional process of migration, whether it be the Global Compact or the regional, the new important documents that everybody is talking about, there is minimal presence of civil society. So it's mainly, again, UN agencies, states, that's all. I think I covered most of the questions.
I just want to comment on this self-marginalization or marginalization when you're saying that, because we know that refugees in Egypt tended to marginalize themselves out of hope that they would be resettled. So they wouldn't
learn
For
Arabic
example,
or-
we've been providing English classes for refugees for a long period of time, and they would come to these English classes. But when we tried to provide Arabic classes, there was no interest. So I know about this, and also the state for treating the refugee in Egypt as a temporary case is quite understandable, because the policy of the state is not for local integrations, and it's clearly stated in the MOU. But this is really disappointing to know that even civil society that should be working on promoting the idea of local integration and trying to reconsider, promote the Egyptian government to reconsider the MOU with the UNHCR and to put local integration into the agenda, because neither resettlement is possible nor repatriation.
Yeah.
So it's really disappointing to know that civil society also is believing this temporary.
I think it comes to lack of familiarity. I mean, they're not familiar with working with Egyptians, and they don't know the repercussions of interacting with Egyptians. So they think it's safer, like, to move with the normal system. Like, as I said, the UNHCR system, the isolated system, and again, adding to your point, despite the fact that officially local integration is difficult. I mean, as I explained in one of my findings, different representatives of relevant apparatuses say that serving Egyptians as a quota when you're getting a fund from refugees is acceptable, and we accept funds for refugees. So again, it's not as, it needs a little bit of effort from civil society, and that's from where my criticism comes from. That I understand, I'm not underestimating the legal barriers and the problems and challenges, but again, they are so much counting on this UNHCR system that it's becoming a state inside the state. That's my.
And it fits your explanation that they are more
self-indulgent.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah. So we have more.
No, I just have a comment. It's not
sure.
Because I think the problem of that Egypt is dealing with the refugees as a temporary phenomena. I think this is not restricted to Egypt.
Of course.
This is an international. Even UNHCR is dealing with refugees as a crisis.
Of course.
And that there will be a time
that they all go back.
And it's just something that happened, and it will blow over in a few years, even though there was no point in time when there were no refugees.
Yes.
This is something that. It's not a crisis. It's
yes, of course, but in some
built.
Countries there are. Not some countries. In the Western countries, at least there is this possibility of eventual temporary. Okay, now they are temporary protection, but naturalization. But here there is no talk about at all possibility of local integration. So, do we have any questions?
I may miss the answer from the Maisa's question, but my question is that, is there any advantage or uniqueness of the Egyptian NGO's assistance than the INGO? Is there anything, for example, how can you differentiate? I don't know, but the Egyptian-led or the Egyptian or Arabic-speaking people-led NGOs versus so-called Western NGOs, Western people-led NGO. Is there any uniqueness, goodness, since CMRS is planning to have the training with IOM? Is there anything you can tune in, the good things, uniqueness, or you are just training as same as other NGO, other Western training institute is providing? That's my question.
This is a question for me?
No, maybe, I don't know if you experienced with the NGOs. I experienced in the international organization, plus Japanese NGO or American NGO, and so on and so on. So I have a big difference between Japanese NGO and Western NGOs. That's why I raised this question.
In response to your question, there are, of course, pros and cons for each of them. I mean, the INGOs, they're much more, they have better legal statuses, better legal policies, because there's, in terms of the legality, INGOs, they fall under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. NGOs, they fall under the Ministry of Social Solidarity. So there are different laws, and it's a little bit easier for INGOs. But this is not the only thing. I'm not talking about Egypt. Generally, also INGOs, they have better bookkeeping system. They have better, they're more transparency, budgeting, and they're more also skills in terms of provision of services. However, when we talk about the unequal relations, we are bringing in actual examples of local NGOs and even NGOs that the problem is I'm a little bit constrained because there are only a handful in Egypt, so I don't want to kind of give more description. But there are also some NGOs that are run by one of the members of the community, but they are registered legally. And these respondents have told me that they kind of, as I mentioned, their lists are being used, their contacts are being used, and then at the end, because they have less links with funding donors and maybe even less skills in terms of writing a proper funding proposal, bigger funds goes to bigger organizations. And also UNHCR, I've said it so many times, that for them it's much easier for them to work with bigger organizations than with smaller ones. So the added value are normally having access to the community, knowing more about the community, and having more outreach to these cases that I say outside the realm of UNHCR. But in general, if you look on the onset, you would feel that INGOs have better skills, and this is something unnegotiable in terms of, having more access, in terms of, we're talking about responses, we're talking about programs, that's different. But what I'm trying to say is that the smaller CSOs are being used sometimes by INGOs. So that's the thing. So there's a hierarchy. It's not that each of them, they work separately. So bigger organizations need smaller ones to get the accurate caseload and to get the accurate information. But then at the end of the day, they get less money because of the hierarchy of funding. The question was not for me.
About training. About the training. Okay. No, can we talk about it after the lecture? Because it's targeting the government. It's not civil society. Okay. So, do we have any questions, or we would stop here?
I have this question before, whether cooperation between the civil society organization. I asked this question before, whether cooperation between or within the civil society, between the civil society organizations takes place or not.
I responded saying that.
No, you were talking about the Mediterranean. Yeah, not regional.
You also asked about the regional.
Yeah, exactly. So okay. I meant.
So within, if you're talking about within Egypt, the only cooperation that they do, as I said, is in the standard operating procedures and interagency working group within UNHCR. So there is always these frames with UNHCR. You have a protection working group, you have a health working group, where they all kind of have a system where this person goes to this organization, then follows as a referral with this organization. But in terms of accurate cooperation, I can't really say there is any, because all of them, they're competing for the same funds. So there's also a little bit of competition, as I explained. So it's within the bigger systems of UNHCR, yes, there is the referral systems and operating procedures, but as informal or even less formal cooperation, and not that I've known of or not that I've witnessed through my interviews.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that cooperation in this local level, not within the framework of the international organizations, that this is not possible due to the
because they are
due to the competition,
over the same funds, over the same programs, and over the same caseload. So it's better for them to work separately. And this is something that one donor agency have complained of. He said, I received the same proposals. There are duplicates. Don't you know that this is being done through this organization already? He was very angry. And I think he has a point. So they can even at some point, not really recycle, but they can duplicate a program that is already happening just for the sake that they want to do it. So there's less really communication and cooperation that I think is not because there is no means for it, but rather that they don't prefer to communicate. It's not really difficult. They're all here operating in Cairo, but they prefer to work separately.
But do you think it would be better for the refugees to cooperate?
Of course, because you will avoid duplicated services. You will avoid also having programs that have no use for some refugees. These funds could be divided. But again, I don't think it's the case in Egypt. I think politics, because I've read it all throughout my study, there's the politics of civil society. There are lots of books about this. Mm-hmm. One of them is by, I forgot, Maha Abdurrahman, and she says the uncivil society and the politics between them. So there's a lot of politics between the organizations, but at the end of the day, they are organizations with different aims and objectives, and so, you know, some of them they prefer to have, of course, the best fund and the best program, and so it's not as, and this is what I really like about James Scott, because it's not always utopian and it's not always selfless. I mean, these people also work for a reason, so I think it's doable, but they just don't feel like doing it. That's what I think.
One last question. Do you think that maybe international organizations or INGOs could give them an incentive to cooperate? I'm asking a lot on this particular point because I wrote my thesis on...
Okay, I thought you were working for one of them.
No.
For one of them. Okay.
I wrote it on social capital and... Okay. Forming alliances and networking and so on.
INGOs can help with this cooperation.
Yes, bring them together or give them an incentive that working together might be more beneficial for them.
I see some sarcastic smiles from people who used to work in these organizations. I don't have an answer. I'm sorry.
I think, I mean, Sarah actually answered you. I think the problem is bigger. It's the politics of civil society in Egypt, right?
And also in this field, because also everyone now is working with migrants, so it's becoming a little bit political.
Okay. One last question.
Going back to the point from earlier, I just was wondering, to what extent did you maybe encounter in this kind of question about the proposals and these tensions between that and duplication, maybe some tensions about which populations are being called out in these proposals or targeted, and how much that's affecting the relationship between the CSOs and also within the populations that they're serving. Of course, Syrians are
okay.
Big
within
population.
The population, I've just, it was not part of the research, but I've heard the random frustration expressions from African groups that they think everything is Syrian now, but this is something really, I mean, I heard it on a friendly manner, so I can't really say it's a finding. But also, of course, there was, like I said, it's not only victims of trafficking or SGBV cases, it's also Syrians. So in the last few years, because there have been injection of funds on Syrians, and so INGOs and also local NGOs, they started working heavily with Syrians. And of course this, again, it brings us back to the question of donors' agenda. So again, these organizations are not working autonomously. I mean, they are, and they said it very clearly. They said, we really hope that one day we will have an open call for proposal where each one of us will propose what we see relevant. But what we do is that we receive a proposal, we try to tailor what we want to do according to this proposal. So these proposals, I've seen so many of them, and they're normally very targeted. I mean, they either target the Syrians, or even they target women, or they target children. Some of them they target for a reason. Like if there's a trend of trafficking, of course you target victims of trafficking. But sometimes it gets too much. Like you have different donor agencies serving the same target group, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of duplication. And you have others who have been here for years and they're still vulnerable, but nobody really funds them. And the organizations can fund them because they depend on the donor's agenda. So again, it's, like I said, it's a little bit of a vicious cycle that, and that's why in my critical approach to civil society organizations, I also acknowledge all of these problems. I'm not saying that they just don't feel like, you know, doing the right fitted programs. It's just that they are operating within a system that they have to give in to, whether it be the local system or also the global. That's why I went back to the global refugee regime and how the major donors who are very far away, they affect the way service is provided to refugees in the receiving country or an asylum country as Egypt.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think we have to...
We have one more question?
Okay, one last
one
question.
final question.
To the best of my knowledge, that any NGO, its process is to fill the gap between government and the local people. Okay, so do you think that it's better for any NGO inside Egypt to make a coordination with government or authorities before providing its needs or its aids to the local people or the refugees or whatever?
I think they already do. I mean, most of any any funds are approved through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think they already do. I mean, they don't work in isolation. And as one of my colleagues has just reminded me that in recent years there has been a trend where not all, but some of the organizations that have the mandate or the capacity, they work with national councils dealing with refugees, so migrants, whether it be the National Council for Childhood and Motherhood, dealing with Egyptian migrants, outflows of young Egyptian migrants, or the National Council for Combating Illegal Migration and Trafficking. So I think they already do. But the thing is that most of the work that they do is social relief, really, socioeconomic services that they provide to their target groups with. I don't know whether this would entail an intervention from the government, but what I know is that they work within the scope. They get their approvals from the government, so they work under the auspices, really, of the government.
Yes, I think that it will be not possible for providing aids without permission from authorities. I think so.
Okay, so what's your question? I'm sorry.
Yes. According to this, I attended a panel in Greece about the providing and distribution of aids for refugees anywhere. And there was a center, its name, a Civil Military Coordination, or a CEMIC. Yeah, I don't know you know this term or not. For coordination between all members or all NGOs and military and the government for unifying all efforts for refugees.
But I mean, again, I'm not sure I'm getting this right. But I mean, apart from the approval, I think also the government gets involved in the RRP, the resilience. I'm not sure the abbreviation.
3RP.
The 3RP. It was mainly for regional response resilience plan for Syrians, and I think different governments in the region they got involved in both the findings and the cluster services to be provided to Syrians. So in terms of distributing aid, I mean, as I said, some civil society work with both Egyptians and migrants or refugees. Some work only with refugees, but they all either, like I said, they get their approval from Foreign Affairs or social solidarity. So that's the way they deal with the government, or incapacitating, or I hate to use this word, or raising the capacity of national councils, whether it be dealing with their own caseload or dealing with the refugee caseload. Recently, NGOs have started to work closely with these councils to try to, as my colleague reminded me, to avoid this parallel system and to enhance the system that works both for Egyptians and refugees. So this kind of cooperation is there, but there's also a lot of legal challenges faced. You know, when things take more time in terms of bigger strategic plans than normal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll stop here. Sarah, I thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and I thank all of you for coming and for your questions. I would like to end this session or this seminar by just reminding you that I already sent an announcement. I hope most of you are on my mailing list, but we are having an event on the 3rd of December. Honoring the memory of late Professor Barbara Harrell-Bond, who was actually the one who founded this center in 2000, and she was the acting director of the center, and then continued as an advisor and a professor. She is a person who devoted all her life for refugee cause. She was the first to be critical of humanitarian assistance, of UNHCR, and I would really like to see all of you attending her. We will screen a film on her that was produced by someone who was also working at CMRS, Kasia Grabaska, who Sarah mentioned in her PhD, and then we will have some activists and scholars and researchers who were honored to work with Barbara to talk about their experience. So I would love to see you. It will be in the Falaki Theater, not in this building, but the other building. And then also in December, we have our last seminar of the semester by Professor. Yeah. So again, we'll see you twice. Okay. Thank you for coming here, and see you soon. And refreshment in the back.